I think the one thing that's really, really made a difference to me and that changed my leadership approach is that learning that relentlessness is not just a difficult to pronounce word. It's a skill that is required for success and that many professionals actually don't have it to see through tough times. And I think training this muscle within the organization helps to be more successful. I also think that is specifically something that like when you move back into the more like digital purpose sided scene, others lack having sometimes. So I think this is where consulting is really, really strong.
Welcome to the Product People podcast, where we discuss trends and actionable advice with great product leaders.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Product People podcast. I'm here today with Janis Bode, VP Product and Technology Operations at N26, one of the European banking unicorns. Hi Janis.
Good afternoon, Mirella.
So Janis, how did you get into product and tech? What was your journey like?
Yeah, the journey is a little bit unexpected, I would say. I got into this sphere of actually being a game nerd as a teenager, like I think many, but then I explored everything that was happening behind the game. So I started to hack and modify games, discovered like level editors, scripting engines, etc., and started to play around, which then eventually culminated in building a game towards the end of my school career. And then, doing that by doing like game design within that and through exploring more and more, moving into programming, first little things and larger software, moving away from games, moving more into administration software, which I did for a long while, some entertainment software. And then eventually I started studying math. I thought the whole gaming programming thing, wouldn't be much of a thing when studying math. And then I realized throughout the studies that it's actually very relevant for the things that were interesting me. So the whole gaming thing, and went back into computer graphics eventually, programming that, developing algorithms here and mathematical models. And while doing this and really specializing a lot in geometric algorithms and computer graphics, I figured out that I actually enjoy organizing more than the actual software or design work. I enjoy the whole work and the whole workflow, but I don't want to be the specialist designing something, building a model, programming anything. But then I'm really more interested in organizing these crafts together than doing it myself, which is why then I eventually decided to end my research career in geometrical research and move back into a games company, but eventually not as someone actually building software, but as someone who's helping others organize everything around it. And then there's kind of escalated into me taking another role and another role and another role. For anyone who's in the tech ecosystem, I think knows how this works. You start as something and 10 years later, you're somewhere very different. And this is exactly what happened to me.
Yeah, we've all been very lucky with how tech just grew as an industry. And you've also been a consultant at McKinsey. So how does the consultancy experience influence your current leadership approach?
Yeah, first of all, I always thought when I started studying, I was interested in, being a researcher, doing math, also doing games. I was also really interested in being a consultant. And I thought, wow, that's like an impossible wish, like you have to make a choice either or. Then I made the choice for, gaming. And to my biggest surprise, all of a sudden, McKinsey became interested into what I was doing, which was to me entirely something that I would have never expected. But obviously also the big consultancies were thinking about how to digitize and were looking for people that were coming from the scene. So this is how I eventually came into consulting, helping eventually other companies digitize and also redo the consulting approach that we did with McKinsey from classic technology strategy consulting to like a more integrated approach that will also leverage design thinking and agile methodologies, etc., and bring the best of both worlds, ideally together, to help our customers digitize. So obviously there were a few things that I brought to consulting from my experience before, which were, the startup mentality and everything that you do in the digital sphere as a problem-solving skill. But obviously the more strategic approaches that are led within consulting is something obviously that I've learned, certain strategic techniques, certain logic trees, certain way of deduction that for me, obviously coming from math wasn't foreign, but applying it in business as a different context. So I think all of this is very expected when you are exposed to consulting. I think the one thing that's really, really made a difference to me and that changed my leadership approach is that learning that relentlessness is not just a difficult to pronounce word. It's a skill that is required for success, and that many professionals actually don't have it to see through tough times. And I think training this muscle within the organization helps to be more successful. I also think that specifically something that, like, when you move back into the more like digital purpose sided scene, others lack having sometimes. So I think this is where consulting is really, really strong where I work, but also like most of the consulting companies have this as a traditional skill.
Yeah,
Secondly,
tradition muscle.
yeah, exactly. And also not just executional muscle, but also like not giving up. Like it looks like really bad, but like the consultant will typically not give up. They will find then, if it needs be, they will start from 0 3 times. That's fine. And then at some point in time, there's a solution. And if a perfect solution isn't possible, they will find the best approximation to the perfect solution. So I think this is really something that I learned, like when it looks really bad, most people like give up too early. And this is something learning at a consulting firm, I think, is really, really helped and changed my leadership approach that I live since. Yeah, I think second thing is I've learned that proper communication in short time with a clear logic and specifically also an aligned lingo save a lot of time for alignment within an organization. Typically, I would say most of the productivity loss in an organization is not the typically complains slow engineer. I think we've all been in a company where their engineering is slow, they don't deliver anything in time. To my experience, that's hardly ever the real problem. I think the real problem mostly is the engineers are doing the wrong things because someone briefed them to do the wrong thing, or the requirements haven't been clear. We are just building the wrong thing, or we are waiting very long for each other. Someone is doing something, finishes it, the person who needs it doesn't get informed, and like out of the actual processing time, we've been sitting around for like 90% of the actual time. And many of these things is actually communication related, and we're just like missing out on communication. And often it's that people talk to each other, but they're not saying the same, not understanding the same thing. One person is actually believing that they confirm X, and the other person is understanding not that, and therefore, doesn't progress as expected. Which is why I mentioned this thing about an aligned lingo. A team and an organization needs some sort of language that everybody understands, that is compatible with everybody, that also doesn't trigger conflict within the organization, and therefore either doing this through having very explicit communication norms or training or team sessions is, to me, I think, a very relevant piece of making sure there is an aligned lingo. Or
What's your secret for that? Is that I know what you mean, and maybe the audience as well. When people say OKRs, but everyone did and does OKRs very differently depending on which company or department they're at. Everyone uses Agile, but probably means something different. People use product discovery and also have a different understanding. Did you see that more useful to just go away from these words and translate them into something simple, or have very rigid definitions of what people should mean when they use that specific word?
yes, there is always a different understanding of like what an OKR is, and then you take literature, and there are, I don't know, 3 different major schools that all have a slightly different interpretation of what that is. That to me is not so much the issue that I mean here. I think that can be defined. For me, obviously, the question was around how did consulting influence my leadership approach. And what I really learned was when I left consulting and moved back into digital scene, I realized that I had a certain compatibility with other ex-McKinseys. I often even didn't know that they were ex-McKinseys, but we shared similar terms. We shared similar problem-solving approaches. Even now, when I approach a certain problem, then I go by the very simplest framework, that my brain is just programmed for, is like situation, complication, resolution. And then everyone who's like McKinsey trained is like, oh yeah, sure. Certain way of doing like a problem tree, certain way of making a slide layout, certain way of meaning behind the word when you say MISI or anything like. So I'm more talking about these like day-to-day terms where there is a certain training and skill set behind that makes this collaboration automatic. Obviously, then you also meet people from other big consulting firms over time, and you learn that they have different lingo. There's a way to adjust and to make this compatible. Like once you actually figure out that this lingo exists, and therefore I think it's very relevant to understand which backgrounds and which lingo the management and leadership team that you're working around with have, and making sure that you either have this compatibility or that you create it for these relevant terms. So for me, that's what I mean by an aligned lingo. And if you don't have, obviously, the minority of people in companies will have a consulting background. Yeah. So in those cases, I think it's relevant, and I think in actually all of the cases, you should have like an explicit time that you should be setting up in order to create your lingo. You can document it. You can, have workshops about it, retrospectives, whatever. But like making sure that you don't just assume that you understand each other, but work on it. And that can start obviously with team value exercises. It can start with, explaining in certain contexts, what did someone mean by X, Y, Z, and then aligning on this is how we mean this. Like when we're saying X, Y, Z. And sometimes it seems a bit petty and useless for the individual to be explaining something that for them is obvious. I think exactly stating the obvious, specifically when a team is forming, is very, very relevant, such that teams actually create a lingo, and ideally even explicitly. That's what I mean by a lingo, and like learning from consulting. Maybe one more sentence, typically from consulting. When you start off a new project, typically on the first day, you have a session where you're talking explicitly about like your lingo, your norms. And this is something that I took from consulting that is actually pretty easy to do. Any team can do in any setup when they like work together in a new setting.
Yeah, I agree. So stating the obvious or just the basics is highly underrated. Even for things where you assume everyone reacts the same, like responding to calendar invites. I've noticed some people, ideally you should respond yes or no, right? You shouldn't like leave the meeting unresponded to. But some people do that. And for some people, it means that they're coming. And for other people, it means that they've rejected it, but didn't want the rejection to seem harsh or something like that. And I noticed that we're working with different clients with very senior people. I was surprised because for me, that felt like meeting etiquette 101. People should kind of know what you're doing and if they should be waiting for someone rather than having a group of people who hasn't reacted to that meeting invite despite it being sent days in advance. So fully agree with you of stating the basics and saying, okay, this is how we tick, or this is how we were going to work, and this is accepted and this shouldn't be done. It goes a long way. And especially for the mid and junior level folks, because if they see the senior ones sometimes behaving contradictory, then they also wouldn't know which model to follow. And then it becomes even more difficult for the team to figure out a way.
Yeah, also, I must say, throughout my career, I've often wondered why the seniors were so bad at some standard habits, some standard techniques. And now, being in this position myself, I just realize sometimes my workday just doesn't allow for elaborate communication. It just doesn't
That's the way I
allow it.
feel.
Again, exactly. It just doesn't allow for doing everything right in a way that me, having worked as a coach in the past, have trained these things myself. So I know how these techniques work, but sometimes I just can't, even though I know how it works, because it's too expensive in the moment for me to do it. Specifically in these moments, it's absolutely essential that the people that I communicate to have been norming with me. We have a joint lingo, we have a joint understanding that they know when I just give them a 3-sentence message that they understand what I don't mean, which means I don't mean anything personal. I'm not annoyed. I just have no time, and we understand each other, right? So very typical team building, but this can be accelerated by obviously like having a joint lingo, and then therefore also covers more context.
Fully agree. So going back to the work you did after going back to the tech industry, what's the most complex initiative or project that you've managed and you can of course talk about?
Yeah, I think there's always more and more coming in terms of complex projects. I think one that really stuck with me is one that was very early in my career, where I think I still worked for this games company. We had a system where players could play for real money, and real money play. So basically, you pay in some money, then you win or lose your game, and if you win, you get more money. And this is a bit of an edge case. In many countries, this is allowed. In other countries, it's totally banned and considered gambling. There are edge cases, like certain types of games where this is allowed. And we had a business model where this was happening in France, and then France basically changed their laws, called our company's name out in the Assemblée Nationale, and we were like, okay, doesn't sound good, because apparently the parliament specifically had us in mind when banning this business model. So then the Spanish regulator contacted us and basically gave us 6 weeks of time to change our business model, or they would shut down our platform in France, which was a problem for us because France was our second biggest market and made a significant share of our revenue. So we were in risk just by changing the business model to be put out of business value. So me, with 2 years of job experience, I was put against this project. Basically, take whoever you need from the company, just implement this without having any product specifications to full launch within 6 weeks was a bit of a deal. So had to coordinate not just the engineering and design and product teams as usual, but also marketing, finance, legal department to get all of this done. Yeah, for me, that was, I think, most complex initiative so far, also because of like the timing pressure, having no context, having no experience. Was, looking back, very exciting, but I think it was the one time also in my life that I was close to burning out. I think afterwards I've been managing that pretty well. But that one was really, really tight. Fortunately,
very intense 6 weeks.
Yes, absolutely.
So what would be your advice for companies who want to operate within Germany and the European Union in general, considering regulations are way more stringent than in other places? One example you gave me earlier was the Supply Chain Act. So maybe we can start with that. You can also pronounce it in German and go forward with your advice towards companies who want to be successful in this market.
Yeah, so I'm happy to pronounce the Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz to you. And I'm always happy that get good smiles for when pronouncing a very long German word. So I think there's obviously a lot of regulation more and more in the EU, but also I think specifically in Germany being like one of the most toughly regulated spaces around. So my learning when in Germany or any other location, but I can only really speak for Germany. When in Germany and you're highly regulated, hire Germans. It seems a little bit obvious, but I think now when we're looking in the tech scene specifically, also I think in the Berlin ecosystem, it's highly international, which is great. And like also in all places, it's highly international. That includes everyone that's working on like regulatory and legal context, which is also wonderful. But I do realize that sometimes there are certain responsibilities that are only covered like by internationals who don't always have the full context. In some cases, you don't have a team member that's speaking, not a single team member that is speaking German, which is not ideal. So I always need a native speaker, ideally a native speaker in the team. And the second thing that I also realized a while ago is even if a person that moved into the country speaks fluent German, there is still a nuance between speaking a language and understanding the cultural implication of what a person that is talking to you, specifically when they are from a regulated stakeholder, the lawmaker or anything, they have a cultural context, a connotation with their communication. So these people might understand what they are saying, but not necessarily what they're meaning. It's a little bit going back to the lingo again. They're not having this, they speak the same language, but they don't have the same lingo. And therefore here, you don't just need to make sure that you're having a person speaking the language of the complex regulation. That is important and step one. But for critical things, there also needs to be one who is understanding the cultural context. I can only speak for Germany. I'm pretty sure this is also true for any other country, and therefore I think that is something that shouldn't be missed, even when sometimes in the tech scene having locals is not so trivial in some cases.
Yeah, and I agree with you because also in tech we're quite utilitarian in our thinking, and I noticed that for myself as well as we were looking at a venture in the healthcare space focused towards longevity, and to be able to support that you kind of need to know the risks of a person, and one of the easiest way to know risks is via genetic testing, right? And you have all these off-the-shelf things. Turns out in Germany that's a bit difficult legally because doctors cannot order them. And I was like, why not? That's so obvious. And then, of course, I had someone explain to me, but the things that happened in the past made Germany a little bit reluctant around these very touchy topics. And then that ended up being caught up within the whole historical and cultural context of it. While it's useful for preventative medicine, I mean, patients could still do them off the shelf, but it's a bit more difficult to tie that in with a doctor's practice or with a medical service focused towards longevity. So that was also a surprise for me because I wouldn't have expected it to be a problem.
That's exactly true, right? I think we need to be aware that in some form we're also here living in a bubble of internationals where we just assume everyone everywhere is the same and everything's great, where everything's diverse. But then we are confronted obviously sometimes with the locations and their different realities. Obviously, I don't know, when I would now move to Spain, I'd probably also find things that would be very, very counterintuitive to me. And I think that's something someone in a regulated ecosystem needs to be always fully aware of.
Yeah, so there was something in banking I've heard from people who moved to Spain that the tax authorities could just like see all your transactions. So they have some sort of, I don't know if it's hearsay or if that happens with the local bank accounts. I've just heard a comment on it, so maybe I should have put it in the podcast if I haven't fact checked.
Yeah, there are countries that have a more elaborate integration with the transactions, which is actually for fighting fin crime and anti-money laundering is actually a very useful thing, because when you have a system where only banks individually know this and they don't know of the other banks, then once it's moving from one bank to the other, like the trace is lost. But if a regulator can see all of it, they can see the whole trail of something moving around and can obviously find patterns on their side like much easier. So there is a maybe strange and concerning on the one hand when you like have certain doubts about why does the state have access to all of this. There is obviously also some benefit to it. So I think it's a decision that every country and every hopefully democracy needs to make on their own, whether they draw the line between fighting fin crime and their personal like data security and like access of data privacy rights.
And that also takes me to the next question on how do you envision AI and machine learning in general helping streamline compliance and operational efficiency, especially in the fintech sector?
Yeah, so I mean, there is a lot of use cases, and I'm sure if we would talk again in half a year, I would have 10 further examples. So I think it all started off by, say, more advanced scraping of information where a company, specifically a bank, always needs to be up to date with the respective regulation. And there is also like teams that are responsible for the regulatory screening. But obviously this can be supported, and also the understanding can be augmented by like leveraging AI. So creates like a faster integration of like regulatory information into the organization, not just necessarily funneling through the experts, but ensure that near time everyone has an understanding and then the experts refine this as they usually do. So that's one. The second thing that I can see is that also when there is a certain screening of information, certain internal data versus some regulatory text, and a little bit like an audit, some of these audit activities can be conducted if trained properly, like by an AI bot for one's own topics. Also the accumulation of data from other parties, for example, that you work with. A big part of regulation is like how to work with vendors, how is the data shared, and then they all have security or other reports that you need to consume. They all have a different format, and then you have 100 of them. And bringing this all like into your local logic requires lots of translation work that can be AI aided. Obviously not fully conducted, because the requirement is that final responsibility is always with the human, but it can be definitely AI aided and therefore speed up the process of this much better. You can also observe that in many cases it catches errors or problems just like faster and sometimes even more reliable than a human. So therefore that's a big help. And then also the timing when it is around like certain payment transactions or finding suspicious patterns in like transactions or any other customer interaction can also be AI aided and like help a lot in simplifying the process here for the agents that are eventually responsible.
Awesome. So seems like you're very excited about these developments and already have been implementing a lot. Thanks a lot for being here today with us, and look forward for our next conversation.
Thank you, Mirella. It was a pleasure.